Middle-earth is more than just land. It is the memory of ancient heroes and the terrors that awoke with the first light of dawn. Today, an old wizard will tell you. Yet another legend, so you may understand that even the darkest times can give birth to light in the days when Gundor stood proud and the memory of Numer still lingered in. The blood of kings there rose upon the eastern border of the realm, a shining city, Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Moon. Tall were its gleaming walls of white stone kissed by silver light, and high upon its central spire shone the moon crystal, a gift from elven hands and ages. Long past it stood as a vigilant eye, gazing ever toward the black lands of Mordor, a bastion of hope and beauty at the edge of but beauty such as this is, ever a flame that dark things covered, and beyond the mountains in the deep heart of Mordor the Dark Lord stirred at the time of our tale. The third age had long begun, and Gundor was mighty still, though its strength had begun to knee. Like the moon at the months, and the captains of the realm watched the east with weary hearts, for strange whispers came on the wind of fires rekindled in the ash fields of Gorgoth, of a dreadful eye of flame atop a black tower rising. Once more Barad, the fortress of Sauron, had awakened in Minas Ithil. Under the argent banners of the moon dwelt Captain Irulan, a man of Númenórean descent, proud and tall, with hair the color of raven's wings and eyes the hue of steel. He was young by the reckoning of his people, but already battle-hardened, having fought in the wilds against orc raiders and darker things that slithered from the east. Yet for all his valor, a shadow had begun to creep into his dreams each night as he lay beneath the carved dome of his tower chamber. Aurelian dreamed of a sky without stars, and a moon grown black. He saw Minas Ithil wreathed in mist and green flame, its towers twisting as if in pain, and always in the final moment before waking he heard a voice, a whisper sibilant and cold, speaking words he could not understand, though they clung to his mind like frost. He told no one of these dreams save one master, Liron, an aged lawkeeper who had served 3 kings, and remember the days when Ilder himself walked these halls. Liron bent aback and sharp of mind, listened gravely, his hands clasped over a cane of whitewood. "These are not dreams, my captain," he said quietly one dawn as the light crept through arched windows. "They are warnings. The enemy reaches out. He would break the spirit of Minas Ithil before ever laying siege to her gates." Aurelian frowned then. "Let him come, and see that we do not break easily." Erlong looked upon him with weary eyes. "Pride can be turned to ruin." Aurelian, "Listen to me while there is something beneath this tower, deep within the foundations, where even stone remembers the footsteps of Isildur, a relic from Numer itself. It is hidden, forgotten by many, but the enemy remembers." "What is it?" asked Arden. His voice hushed. Leon shook his head. "Better you do not know. What matters is this: if Minas Ithil falls, it must not fall in a shadow. Not entirely. This relic must be kept from the hands of the 9. At that name Ion felt a chill pass through him. The Nazgul, the ring-wraiths, servants of Sauron, once kings of men, now little more than wraiths, clad in black robes and bound by rings of power. It was said they rode on steeds of nightmare and brought fear with them like a cloak. "Are they coming?" he asked. Lean only nodded, and so the days grew darker. the moon seemed dimmer in the skies above Minas Ithil in the air. Colder though it was not, yet winter birds flew strangely, and beasts grew restless in the woods. One evening the watchman on the eastern wall beheld a great gathering of crows wheeling in mad spirals above the mountains of shadow. And far beyond at the edge of sight, they glimpsed red flickers, fires burning in the land of Mordor. Then one night came the scream. It was not the cry of beast or man, but something older and more terrible, a wail that pierced the very soul, rising from the black skies like the shriek of despair made flesh. The stars seemed to flinch, men fell to their knees, and those who had never known fear now tasted it bitter as Ash the Nine had come. Captain Elian stood upon the moonlit battlements that night, watching the eastern road. In the distance he saw them 9 riders cloaked in black, unmoving, as if waiting for the darkness to deepen. Their presence brought a stillness to the land, as though the world itself dared not breathe in their presence. Behind them the armies of Mordor gathered, trolls and orcs in countless numbers, their torches like rivers of flame pouring through the mountain passes. Alien turned to his captains and gave no rousing speech, no words of grandeur, only this: tonight we are the shield, let us not be broken. And so the gates of Minas Ithil were shut, the horns of war were sounded, and the tower of the moon prepared to withstand storm. But deep beneath the tower, Liron moved in secret, guided by ancient keys and older knowledge, seeking the hidden relic of Numer. For if the wolves fell and fall, they might, the light must not be wholly extinguished. And above in the heavens, the moon began to vanish behind a veil of shadow. The hours that followed were veiled in dread, for as the sun dipped behind the western peaks, it cast no gold upon the city's towers, but a one and colorless light, as though the world itself recoiled from what approached. The men of Minas Ithil stood upon their walls, clad in burnished mail, and bearing long spears and white-crested helms, and their hearts were troubled not by the might of Mordor's host alone, but by the weight of silence that settled upon the land, unnatural and deep like the hush before the falling of a great doom. Captain Ilian moved among them, not with grand words nor boasts of defiance, for he was no herald of hollow courage, but a man born of number, Manorian line, with the quiet fire of his forefathers burning in his blood. His voice was steady as he spoke to the watchmen, his presence a balm to those who wavered. He knew well that fear once rooted in the soul could spread like rot through a company of men. And so he walked beneath the shadow of dread, bearing the weight of command, not with pride, but with solemn duty. Below the tower, in secret chambers carved by hands long vanished from the circles of the world, Leon, the lawkeeper, moved with haste that belied his age. His lamp cast a pale glow upon the ancient stones, illuminating faded runes that spoke in the speech of westernness. The stair that wound into the depths was steep and treacherous, for none had walked it in many generations. But he did not falter in his hand. He bore a key wrought of silver and adamant, shaped in the likeness of a crescent moon, a relic of old Numer, passed from steward to steward in silence, never spoken of beyond closed doors. Island had given the order: if the gate was breached, Leoron must flee with the relic. A swift horse would wait in the northern tunnel, concealed by brambles and rune-covered stones. The burden of that charge lay heavily upon the old man's shoulders, yet he bore it, for he remembered Ilder's voice stern. And proud when first the tower was raised, he remembered the light that had once filled these halls, and the laughter of men who had never known despair if that memory was to survive then this. Hidden light must not be lost, but outside the walls the nine were. Stirring they had come in silence as phantoms do, but now their terror began to take shape, their voices rose and fell. Chants low and cold calling upon ancient powers from their gauntlet hands they raise blades of sorcery and dread, and there will fell upon the minds of men like a net of iron, even the bravest. Among the defenders felt their knees weaken and their hands tremble upon the hilts of their swords, and still the gate stood. The first assault came swift, and brutal waves of orcs surged from the darkness, howling and shrieking, their faces twisted by malice, their crude weapons glinting with poison, and hate ladders were thrown against the outer walls, and siege towers rumbled forth, borne upon wheels wrought in the forges of Yuden, great boulders flung from catapults hidden in the mists beyond struck the walls with thunderous force, sending shards of stone raining upon the defenders. Yet Minas Ithil held fought atop the main gate, his sword bright in the moonlight, his shield battered and blackened around him. His men rallied and struck down the enemy with grim resolve. They did not cheer, they did not cry victory. They knew the battle was only begun, and the night had not yet reached its deepest hour. From the spire above the moon, crystal still gleamed, though dimly, as if veiled by a shroud. Its light cast long shadows across the courtyard below, where wounded were carried and orders shouted. Smoke drifted through the streets, not yet from fire, but from the torches of the enemy, and the dust of broken stone. Mothers hushed their children in cellars, and the priests in the temple of the stars sang low hymns to Elrith, though their voices quavered with fear in the heart of the tower. Aloran reached the hidden vault. Its door was sealed by a rune lock known only to a few. With a trembling hand, he placed the moon-shaped key into the groove, in the stone before him groaned with age as it opened within the chamber. Set upon a pedestal of white marble was a coffer, simple in shape, adorned only by a single star. It was no larger than a helm, and bound in silver bands. Aaron fell to his knees, tears in his eyes. By the stars of Arendelle he whispered, "Let this not be in vain." He reached for the coffer, and as his fingers touched it, he felt a warmth not of fire, but of memory. A presence stirred within like the echo of a voice long silent, reminding him of white sails upon sea of gardens in Numer, before the fall of voices singing in high towers beneath silver trees. He drew the lid closed, wrapped the relic in a cloth of starlight, and turned to begin the long ascent. Outside, the nine drew nearer. Their cloaks did not stir in the wind, nor did they seem to touch the ground. Each bore a crown of iron and a blade that drank light. They stood together before the gate and raised their hands, as one a wave of cold swept over the city, as if the breath of the dead had fallen upon the land. The men upon the walls cried out, for the fear was upon them now in full black and unrelenting. Some turned to flee, but Elian shouted above the storm, his voice strong as a trumpet's call. Old hold the gate by Elendil's blood. We are the sons of the West, and this city shall not fall while we yet draw breath his men gathered to him once. More, and the tide of dread was stayed for a time, but in his heart Eurylean knew. The truth, this was no siege of arms alone. This was a war of spirit, and the enemy had long mastered the arts of. Despair the gate groaned as shadow touched at the runes etched upon its. Iron skin flickered dimmed and went out the night. Deepened and above the mountain peaks the moon vanished, swallowed whole by a shroud of cloud, and ash the time had come the moon was gone. Where once its light had bathed the white walls of Minas Ithil in soft radiance, now there was only darkness thick, oppressive and deep as the void between stars of black mist rose from the land. Before the gates, not born of nature nor weather, but of sorcery and ancient malice, and within that veil the nine moved like wraiths of fireless smoke, unseen save for the cold that clung to their passage and the dread that followed in their wake. Still the gate stood forged in the days of Islandil, blessed by the hands of those who had walked the undying lands. The outer door of Minhill bore enchantments wrought with care and power, but even such wards, mighty though they were, could not forever withstand the will of Sauron's servants, for the Nazgul did not assault the gate with hammer and ram, but with words whispers carried on a wind that none could see and all could feel. They called to the hearts of men upon the walls, offering promises and curses, weaving visions of ruin and betrayal. They spoke in tongues forgotten in the black speech of Mordor, and in the voices of lost loved ones long dead and buried. And some listened in the darkest watch of the night, 3 of the outer centuries abandoned their posts, dropping helm and shield, fleeing into the streets. Like madmen, they spoke no words, only gibbered, and wept as though their minds had been unmade. Others began to falter, shifting uneasily behind the parapets, their eyes drawn eastward, as if hypnotized. Aurelian saw it, and his soul burned with wrath. He stood before his men, not as one untouched by fear, but as one who refused to yield to it, and with his sword drawn, he spoke to them with a voice clear and cold. Look not into the shadow, lest it take you. Remember who you are. You are not beasts of the hills, nor curs of the east. You are sons of Gondor, and your fathers' names are carved upon the stones of Agalath of Pelargar of the White City itself. They stand in the halls of waiting, watching us now and I. For one will not see them weep for shame. He did not raise his voice beyond what the silence would bear, and yet every man heard it, and the trembling of many hearts grew still for a time. Shields were gripped anew, and spears steadied upon the battlements. The courage of men, so often overlooked in the reckoning of great powers, rose like a flame that darkness could not wholly snuff. Then came the second assault, not by the 9 who remained still as statues upon the field, but by the legions gathered behind them, trolls and iron collars howling, beasts from the east, and wave upon wave of orcs their black blades raised, and their eyes gleaming with bloodlust. The siege engines groaned and rolled forward, and the sky was lit by flaming stones hurled over the walls, trailing fire through the heavens like red comets. The earth trembled beneath the tread of that foul host, and the clash upon the gates was like thunder breaking across the mountains. Topped the walls, the defenders fought as though possessed by a strength not their own. Arrows sang from high Towers pouring down like hail upon the attackers, cauldrons of burning pitch were overturned, casting shrieking fire. Among the ranks of orcs, yet for each enemy that fell 2 more came on. Climbing ladders, breaking through breaches, swarming the outer defenses with reckless fury, Aurelian battled. Without pause, his sword arm red to the elbow, his face blackened with ash and blood around him. The captains of Minas Ithil fought bravely. Talion of the East Gate, grim and tireless Moran the bowman, whose arrows found their mark even in the smoke, and Khalif the young standard-bearer, who had never seen war before this night, yet stood unshaken beneath the moonless sky. But courage alone could not hold forever against such numbers, slowly like water against stone. The tide of Mordor wore away the defenses one by one. The outer towers fell, their white stones turned to rubble, and the streets ran with the blood of the fallen. The gate of the moon, though still shut, groaned under the pressure of battering rams shaped like wolves there, jaws of steel biting at the hinges, and still the 9 did not move. They waited, ever patient, knowing that despair is a sharper blade than any forged in fire. The fear they spread seeped into the mortar of the city itself. Lamps flickered and died. The crystal upon the tower dimmed further, and the songs of the priests faded into silence. Hope, that most fragile of lights, wavered. It was then, in that hour, when it seemed the tower must surely fall, that Lirin emerged from the vaults below, the relic of Numer wrapped in silver cloth, and clutched tightly to his breast. His face was pale, drawn with sorrow, but his steps were steady as he made his way to the northern passage. Hidden behind the wall of the temple, there in shadow waited a small company, messengers and scouts, riders who had not yet drawn sword, but were sworn to flee if the city fell. Elian had chosen them himself. You must not fight, he had told them the day before. Not unless there is no other choice. You must ride with the last light of Ithil, and keep it safe beyond the hands of Shadowlan. Spoke no word as he joined them, but his eyes lingered for a moment on the spire above, and a tear traced the lines of his face. May the Vala shield you, Elian, he whispered, for if you fall, so too does all remembrance. And in the court of the moon, as fire licked at the stones, and the air grew choked with ash, the captain of Minas Ithil stood alone for a moment, gazing eastward. He saw the 9 begin to move, not quickly nor with haste, but with a dreadful certainty. Their forms wavered like smoke, and Reform, tall and terrible one, raised a hand, and the gate, the mighty gate of the Tower of the Moon, shuddered. The last light of Messel flickered, and the night, deep in the hour, was near midnight. When the gate of the moon fell, it did not yield at the sudden crash of broken stone, but with a groan long and sorrowful, as if the tower itself had felt the pain of betrayal. The great hinges, blackened by fire and worn by centuries, twisted and snapped, and the iron doors, carved in elder days with the sigils of Isildur's line, were torn inward by the force of fell sorcery. A wind rushed in with the breach, cold and fated, bearing with it the reek of death and the cries of triumph from the throatless legions of Mordor. Then the 9 came forward, slow and inexorable as fate, their cloaks flowing as though caught in a wind. No man could feel their crowned helms gleaming faintly in the darkness, not with light, but with the reflection of fear. Their eyes could not be seen, yet none who looked upon them doubted that they were beheld, in turn measured and named and condemned. Each bore a blade that sang with malice, and the air before them grew heavy laden with the weight of despair. Captain Aurelian stood upon the broken steps of the gatehouse, sword in hand, his armor scorched, his shield shattered, his guard was fallen, some slain by spear or arrow, others overcome by the shadow that drained the will of the stoutest hearts. Alone he stood, a last defiant figure in a sea of ash and ruin, and when the foremost of the nine stepped through the gate, Elon lifted his blade in challenge. Though he knew the end had come, the creature before him did not speak, but raised its sword in reply, and in that moment all the sounds of war seemed to fall away. There was only the silence of judgment and the clash of two ancient powers, one mortal and doomed, the other immortal, and damned. Their swords met, and the shock of the blow rang like a bell of mourning. Alien staggered beneath the weight of it, for the ring-raised blade was cold as ice, yet struck with the fury of a forge. Sparks flew as they fought, circling in the shattered court beneath the tower, and above them the walls began to crumble, stones blackened by flame and riven by the force of dark enchantments. But though he was but a man, Aurelian did not fall quickly. His strokes were swift, honed by years of battle, and there was yet in him the fire of the West, the defiant pride of a house that remembered Numer. 3 times he struck, and though his blade passed through cloak and shadow, it did not find flesh, for there was no longer flesh to wound the wraith. Did not bleed, nor flinch, nor falter. Then came the 4th blow, and the Nazgul smoked him full upon the chest, and the steel of Elian's breastplate cracked like ice upon stone. He fell to his knees, and the sword dropped from his grasp, ringing softly as it struck the marble floor. But still he raised his eyes, and his voice, though no louder than a whisper, carried through the darkness. Though you cast down this tower and break my body, you shall not take all the light of Ithil lives, yet beyond your reach, and in that moment far to the north, beyond the reach of the battlefield and the veil of smoke, the riders, tasked with the relic, passed through the last secret gate and vanished into the night, their forms swallowed by the trees of Alien. They bore with them no banners, no trumpets, only the burden of memory and the hope of one who had stood when all others fell. The wraith did not answer, but raised its blade once more, yet before it struck the final blow, the captain's eyes turned westward, and he beheld the starless sky, brightened by a faint light on the far horizon, not moon nor star, but the promise of dawn, distant and faint. And in that light he smiled thus: fell Aurelian, captain of the moon, last defender of Minas. The tower was taken. The walls were pulled down or twisted into mockeries of their former grace. The moon crystal was seized and defiled, turned from silver to sickly green, and from it was wrought the witch light that thenceforth crowned the dread tower of sorcery. The streets where once children played, and the priests sang in the high tongue, were filled with shrieks and dark laughter, and the very stones wept with the memory of all that had been lost. Minas Ithil was no more. In its place rose Minas Morgul, the tower of black sorcery, where shadows dwelt without end, and fear lay heavy upon the land. From its gates poured forth the servants of the enemy in ages yet to come, and its windows burned with an unholy light that never faded, yet not all hope was quenched far. Away in the hidden glades of the north, the relic of Numer passed from hand to hand, guarded in secret by those few who remember the captain who had bought them time with blood and valor. What it was no enemy ever learned what power it held. None dared speak aloud, but its light remained like a single star, glimmering through the smoke of a world at war, and those who bore it whispered his name with reverence, even as they walked in shadow. Eurelian, the last light of Minel. Now the tale turns from fire and battle to the road that winds in silence beneath the buffles of the forest. For though Minas Ithil had fallen and the light of the moon tower was lost in the mire of corruption, there yet remained a flicker of its grace in the hands of those who fled, and in their charge lay the slender thread upon which hung the hope of memory and renewal. The stars above Ethelion were few that night, veiled by a thin mist that drifted from the east, as if Mordor's breath now reached even into the once green lands of Gondor's border woods. Yet the riders pressed on, cloaked in gray, and armed not with the purpose of war, but with the solemn weight of guardianship. None among them spoke, for they had all looked upon the fall of the tower, and the fire in their eyes was the fire of mourning, not of glory. At their head rode Aurin, the law-keeper, the relic, wrapped in cradle beneath his cloak, his eyes hollow with sorrow, but unwavering. The path they took was known to few, winding between the roots of ancient trees and through narrow passes that had once served the rangers of alien and secret patrol. It led northward, away from the smoke of war, toward the hidden hills beyond the Anduin, where the knowledge of old things still survived among the wise, though Leon's limbs were frail and his strength failing. It seemed as if the burden he bore lent him endurance beyond measure, for within the relic, what it was none of the riders knew, there pulsed a light not of this age, a light not kindled by sun or moon, but by the remembrance of the West. That was its touch, was like a song from a distant shore, and even in the darkest, what its presence gave warmth to the heart and strength to the will. Yet danger did not slumber. The nine had not ceased their hunt, though Minas Ithil had fallen to wraiths, had known the relic was not within their grasp, and wrathful they became, for the will of Sauron was not easily denied, and his gaze turned westward, seeking always that which had escaped his reach fell. Beasts were loose from the towers of the black land, winged creatures of shadow, neither bird nor bat whose cries froze the marrow, and whose eyes soar through darkness. Upon these the Nazgul rode, scouring the land, their dread voices carrying on the wind. The riders of Gondor knew they must part ways, lest all be caught at once. So, at a place where a stream ran cold from the hills, and the trees grew thick enough to shroud even the sound of hooves, Leon turned to his companions and gave them counsel. This path cannot be walked by many, he said, and his voice, though quiet, bore the firmness of stone. The relic must be taken westward over the river to the fastness of Ammons, or beyond. Let the wise tend it, and let it be hidden even from memory until the time is ripe. I shall ride north, and if they follow me, so be it. That is my part in this tale, and gladly do I ride it to the end. They protested, for he was old and his strength already fading, but he raised a hand and smiled, though his face was lined with grief. You do not understand. I do not ride alone. And with those Words he drew forth, the relic still wrapped in its cloth, and for a brief moment light spilled through the folds. Pale and clear like the first light upon snow, the forest grew still, and even the leaves seemed to hush. The riders bowed their heads. Then, as the sun began to rise, still hidden by cloud, they mounted once more and rode their separate ways. Some toward the western ferry crossings, others deeper into the wild to see out confusion and lead the hunt astray. Leon rode north, his horse swift despite the burden, and none who passed him on the woodland paths, if any such there were, would have guessed the weight of what he bore, nor the fire of purpose that burned within one so bent with years. Behind him the shadows lengthened, the Nazgul did not sleep nor tire. From Minnie's Morgal they had returned to the sky, and there steeds cried out beneath the sunless heaven's black wings swept over Athelion. And the fear that had fallen on Minas Ithil now spread like poison into the heart of the land. But there were places still hidden and warded that they could not pass in haste. The trees of the western forest remembered the elves who had once walked beneath them, and though that memory was dim, it was not wholly forgotten. There, for a time, the light of the relic shielded Laron, and he rested in a dell where white flowers still grew beside a stream, and dreams came without pain. In that dream he saw Eurelion proud and tall, standing once more before the gate. His blade raised, his face serene, and though the voice that came to Aaron's heart was no more than a breath, he heard it clearly. Go on, the light must endure. When Lion awoke, the sky had darkened, and thunder rolled far away in the east. He rose and rode on into lands where few dared tread, seeking those who might receive the relic and guard it until the days of reckoning. For though Minas Ithil had fallen, and its stones now served the enemy, the tale was not ended. There was yet a road before them, long and winding, and at its end a choice that would shape the fate of all peoples. But for now the forest watched, and the wind whispered, not of doom, but of things still hidden, waiting in silence for their hour. The days that followed passed in a shadow, and though the skies above bore no storm, there lay a heaviness upon the land, as if the very earth grieved for the fall of Minas Ithil. The trees whispered softly in the windless air, and birds no longer sang in the branches nor stirred in the hedge. It was as though the forest, once green and bright with life, now held its breath beneath the weight of a sorrow too great for words. Latron pressed ever northward, though his strength began to fail him. The relic still wrapped and bound hung at his side, and the burden of it grew not in weight, but in memory. For with each league that passed beneath the hooves of his mount, he felt the fading light of the city behind him, as if the bond between the relic and the tower from which it had come were being stretched to its breaking point. In the quiet watches of the night he would pause and unwrap it slightly, letting the soft radiance spill forth a gentle glow like moonlight caught in crystal, and he would speak to it in the tongue of old, uttering the names of the kings of Numer and of the stars above the western sea, as if such words might preserve the fading flame by hidden paths and forgotten ways. He traveled, avoiding the broad roads and the bridges that might draw the gaze of the enemy. Once he came upon a ruined outpost, overgrown with ivy and silent as a tomb, and there he rested For a time beneath a broken arch where once the white tree had been carved in stone, a pool lay still at its center, and in its mirror he looked upon his own face and was troubled, for he saw there not the features of the man he had been, but of one drawn near to the edge of death, worn by loss and wearied beyond the telling of it. Yet even so he did not turn back the thought of Elian standing alone before the gate of his last defiance, and the words he had spoken gave Leon strength. The light must not be wholly extinguished, he murmured to the empty stone, and the relic, though silent, seemed to pulse in answer, as if acknowledging the truth of his vow. But evil had not ceased to follow the Nazgul, having scoured the ruins and found no trace of the relic, now spread their search wider. They did not ride always in form that could be seen, but came in the guise of shadow, and dread their presence felt before ever it was perceived, and their voices whispered in dreams, calling to those whose hearts were weak, or unguarded tales spread among the scattered folk of Gondor who still dwelt in the woods and valleys of shadows that passed over the moon of black horses whose hoof beatots made no sound of men, who wandered from their homes and never returned. Leon heard these tales for now, and then he would pause and speak to a shepherd or a hermit in the hills, offering what coin or aid he could spare, and asking in return only for silence. In a moment's shelter most heeded his request, for there was something in his bearing that spoke of old days of time, when the line of Elendil was not yet broken, and the white towers of Gondor still shone as beacons of light in the south. It was in the highlands near the falls of Raros that he met a company of rangers, silent men clad in green and gray, who moved through the woods like the wind itself. Their captain, a tall man named Benil, questioned Liron with careful speech, for he had heard of the fall of Minas Ithil, but not of the relic, nor of those who had borne it forth later, on seeing in him the wisdom of the Doomy Dane and the fire of the north. Entrusted him with part of the tale. There is a light, he said, seated by the fire beneath the stars, not of this world nor born of it, but carried into exile from the realm beyond the sea. It was set in the tower by Isel himself, and now it is lost save in this. And he laid the relic upon a cloth of white linen and uncovered it before their eyes. The rangers fell into silence, and a hush passed over the glade, for the relic shone softly, and its light cast no shadow. Bono gazed long upon it, and when he spoke again, his voice was low and full of awe. This must not fall into darkness, he said. Let us guide you to the river. There are still those west of Anduin who remember the old ways, and who will guard this with their lives. So was that Lin found new companions, and for a time the burden was lightened, though the path before them remained perilous. The Nazgul did not give up the hunt, and their servants now stirred in greater number, wild men of the East Lawn, corrupted by the promises of Mordor, had begun to cross into Gondor's eastern marches, setting fire to farms and slaying those who would not bow. Orcs moved through the mountain passes in bands, and strange beasts, long thought extinct, were seen again in the dark places of the world on the 12th night. As they neared the river, a cry rang out from the sky, a shriek so piercing and terrible that all men fell to the ground, clutching their ears. One of the winged creatures of the Nine swept low over the woods, and its rider searched with burning gaze for the hidden light, but they had already passed beneath the eaves of the trees into a glen where ancient wards still lingered, placed long ago by those who had known the tongues of the elves and the craft of the valor. There the relic's light was cloaked hidden from all sight save the eyes of the pure and the wise in that glen. They waited, hearts trembling as the shadow passed overhead, and when it was gone and silence returned, Lon drew the cloth tighter about the relic and turned his eyes westward. "We are not yet safe," he said, "but the worst is behind us." Beinler placed a hand on his shoulder, and though he said nothing, the warmth of that gesture was answer enough. Beyond the trees the river sang cold and swift, and beyond it lay the lands of Rohan, and the road to the north. They did not know what lay ahead. But the flame they bore had not gone out, it still lived, as did the memory of Minas Ithil and the oath of a captain who had stood alone before the storm. The river lay before them like a ribbon of silver wound through the darkling veil, its waters swift and cold from the snows of the misty mountains and the stars that now began to appear in the high vault of heaven glimmered faintly upon its rippling surface. The banks were steep on the eastern side and thick with alder and willow, but Bernal and his rangers, well acquainted with these lands and all their secret ways, led Len to a hidden ford, narrow and shallow, where smooth stones broke the flow, and the current could be crossed on foot, though with caution. It was near midnight when they reached the place, and no sound stirred save the murmur of the river and the wind among the reeds, for even the beasts of the wild had withdrawn from the banks, as though sensing that some peril moved unseen upon the land there. Beneath the sheltering branches of an old elm, the company rested briefly, and Liron, seated upon a route worn smooth by years of rain and shadow, unwrapped the relic once more, not to gaze upon it in idle wonder, but to feel again the strength it gave, and to ensure that its light had not waned in the journey. And behold, though he had feared that the shadow of the Nazil had perhaps dimmed it, or that the long road had wearied even a sacred flame, the relic shone now more brightly than before, and the light that poured from it was clear and steady like the morning star rising above the sea. It gave no heat, nor did it flicker, but was steadfast, and the hearts of all who looked upon it were gladdened, though a hush fell upon them, for they sensed that they beheld a thing of great power and deep holiness, wrought in a time when the world was young and not yet marred by the malice of Morgoth or the deceit of his servant Beinal, who had not before dared speak of it at length, now knelt beside Ladon and looked long upon the relic, and at last he spoke in a voice low and reverent, as one might speak in the presence of a king, or before an altar in the house of the valor. Though I know not its name, nor the hands that fashioned it, yet I deem that it is older than this age, and was not made by any craft of mortal men. Perhaps it came out of the west from beyond the sundering seas, borne by the faithful when Numer was drowned, or perchance it was given to Elendil by the ELD as a token of hope and light in a time of great darkness. Whatever its beginning, it is now a seed of light in a world that has grown weary, and it must be guarded. Linon bowed his head, and for a moment he was silent, as though overcome by the weight of memory and loss. Then he answered, and his voice trembled like an old harp touched by the wind. It is called Silmaril's echo, though none now living remember the reason for the name. Say perhaps only in part it is said that it was never a gem in truth, but a vessel for something more, some fragment of light, maybe not of the three jewels, yet akin to them in spirit and set within the tower by Isildur not to be, used but to be kept a witness to the glory of the past, and a warning to those who would forget. Barinal did not answer at once, but rose, and looked across the river toward the west, where the land grew dim, and lo there lay Emin and Nin and the green vales that bordered the Anduin, and beyond them the wide plains of Lebanon, and the white towers of Pella far to the south. We shall cross before the moon rises, he said at last, for even now I fear the riders of shadow hunt us still. Though the night hides them from our sight, there is a place in the western hills, near the ruins of an ancient haven, where we may lie hidden. There we shall wait, until word can be sent to those who still guard the law of old. So they made ready, and each man, even Leorin, walked his horse into the ford the water was. Bitterly cold, and the stones beneath their feet were slick with moss, but no voice cried out, and no foe appeared upon. The far bank they passed in silence, and when at last they reached the western shore and ascended the narrow trail into the trees, it was as if a breath long held had been loosed, and they knew they had crossed a boundary. Both seen and unseen, they camped that night in a hollow of birch and holly, where the air was sweet and clean, and no dark dreams troubled their sleep. A watch was set, but none came to disturb them, and though the wind sighed in the high branches, it brought no scent of the east, nor echo of winged terror dreamed that night. And it seemed to him that he stood once more upon the high walls of Minas Ithil, yet the city was whole again, and the moon shone in its full glory above the tower. The air was filled with the sound of bells, and the laughter of children, and banners white and silver flew from the spires. Elian stood beside him, no longer in battle gear, but robed in peace, and he turned and said, "Not all is lost, Larion. Not yet." And then the dream faded, and he awoke with tears upon his face, and the dawn upon the leaves. They traveled westward over the next days, and though the hills were steep and the paths sometimes treacherous, they encountered no foes. In time they came to a hidden dell enclosed on three sides by low ridges of stone and oak-covered slopes. And there they found the ruins Brennel had spoken of, once a watch hall of the faithful, now fallen into moss and silence, but still holding some echo of the grace it had known in elder days. There they made their refuge, and their Lirin at last laid down the relic upon the stone table of the hall, and covered it with a veil woven long ago by hands. "Now turn to dust, it will wait here," he said, "until the time is ripe." And in that quiet place the light endured. Thus the relic was laid to rest in the hidden hall beneath the birches of the western hill country, and there it remained veiled and untouched, guarded, not by walls of stone, nor by blades drawn in defiance, but by silent secrecy, and the faith of those who remembered the old ways. The ruin wherein it lay had once been a refuge of the Dunedain in the earliest days of Gondor, when the shadow of Sauron was thought to be broken, and the kingdoms of men stood tall and unconquered. Now moss had claimed its carvings, ivy had overrun the arches, and the voices that had once echoed in its high roof were long stilled, but the stones remembered, and in their memory the light found peace. For many days Larion remained in that place, his strength greatly diminished after the long flight from the east, and though Baranil offered to ride forth and summon aid from the havens of Lebanon or from the stewards in Minas Ithil, Lawkeeper stayed the hand of haste. Let the relics sleep, he said, let the world forget for a time. Too often do we stir the dust of old glories and draw forth the eyes of evil before their hour. What we have saved was not meant to be brandished like a sword, nor kindled into flame. Too soon it must abide in stillness until the day appointed. And so it was agreed the rangers departed in pairs, leaving no trail behind them, their duty fulfilled, but their watch not ended. For the enemy's malice did not slumber, and many eyes yet sought the relic that had fled there. Graspanil was the last to go, clasping Laurel's hand before he vanished into the misty trees, saying only, when the time comes we will find you, or others will live. We are gone. Thereafter Lon remained alone, save for the birds that nested in the rafters above, and the deer that came to drink from the spring beneath the stones. He built no fire, and he sang no songs, but walked often beneath the trees, speaking softly to himself in the high speech of the West. And sometimes he would sit beside the veiled relic and read from a scroll of law he had carried from the tower, written in the tongue of Numer, and inked by his own hand. His face grew thinner, and his hair whiter, and his eyes seemed to see far away things, though none could say whether they be of the past or the future. Thus the seasons turned. Autumn came, and the leaves fell in golden sheets upon the slopes, and Lion gathered them with care, as if they were jewels. Then came the first snow, soft and clean, and the light of the relics seemed to glow brighter in the cold, as though the frost wakened something ancient within it. He watched the skies often in those months, and though he marked no sign of pursuit, he would rise sometimes in the night and stand watchful by the threshold, listening to the wind with a face both hopeful and afraid. But far to the east, beyond the Isle Duith, Minas Ithil was no longer silent, where once the tower had stood proud and fair. Beneath the gaze of the moon now rose a twisted citadel of pale stone, its walls gleaming with a sickly light, and its spires crowned with fire. The moon, crystal stolen from its place of honor, had been defiled and bound into a new purpose, and from it flowed the dread witch light of Minnie's Morgul green, and cold and deathless the city's fair fountains ran black, and its gardens once rich with Alana and Niferdil now bore only thorns and brambles that dripped poison. The laughter of children and the songs of the Eldar had been replaced by the cries of the tormented and the whispers of the damned. There the Nazgul made their seat, ruling in the name of the Dark Lord, and from that place they issued forth in secret war, sending plagues and fear into the land of Gondor. Wraiths walked abroad by night, and men who had once sworn loyalty to the West now turned their eyes eastward, drawn by promises of power and the seduction of vengeance. Few among them knew whence the evil came, for Minas Morgul was shrouded in spells that clouded the mind and twisted the memory of what had once been. But there were some wise men and lawmasters dwelling still in Minas Ithil who remembered. They spoke in hushed halls of the fall of the moon tower, and of the captain who had stood defiant against the 9 Aurelian's name was not yet forgotten, and in the houses of healing his tale was told to those who depaired as proof that courage may shine even when the light of the world fails. But of the relic they said nothing, save in riddles or hidden words, for none knew where it had been taken, and those who had seen it kept their silence, as Lon had instructed even the stewards. Proud and mighty, though they were, dared not send spies into Minas Morgul, for the very air of that place was thick with death, and no man who crossed its threshold returned unchanged, if he returned at all. And so the tower stood festering wound upon the land, and its light cast a paw upon the mountains, visible from the white city on moonless nights when no wind stirred, yet not all hearts despaired in the north whispers of hope began to stir like the first breeze before a dawn, yet hidden the Dunedain of Arnor scattered, and few though they were gathered often in secret speaking of signs and dreams of a time yet to come when the sword would be drawn again and the enemy faced in the open. The name of Alendil was spoken with reverence, and the air of Isold, though hidden, was remembered. Rangers passed through the lands as silent watchers, and though they did not speak of their purpose, they bore within them the fire of resistance, and beneath the birch-covered hills in the forgotten hall where the stars still shone through a gap in the roof lean, waited his strength waned, and his days grew short, but the relic remained untouched, its light undiminished. He spoke less often now, and his steps were slower, but there was peace in his gaze, for he knew his task was all but ended. The burden he had carried was not in vain, and though he would not live to see the war that would one day come, nor the hand that would raise the banner of the West, and knew he believed with all his heart that the seed he had preserved would bear fruit on the last night of his life, he knelt before the relic and placed his hands upon the veil. The wind stirred through the ruins, and the stars burned bright above. He spoke but one word, and though none heard it, the world seemed to listen, and with that word he passed in his silence his task. Fulfilled years passed like leaves upon the wind, falling in his silence, and forgotten earth, yet the light that had been born from the ruin of Minas Ithil endured. It lay veiled in the hidden hall, beneath the birches of the western hills, untouched and unseen, its presence known only to a dwindling few whose hearts were steadfast, and whose oaths were stronger than the passing of time, though Laren's bones had long turned to dust beneath the stone kin raised above his resting place, and though the world had changed beyond the measure of his memory, the relic remained unspoiled by the hand of time or the reach of the enemy. The hidden dell wherein it had been placed fell into deeper shadow as the days grew darker and the lands around it became wild. Once more the paths that led to it were overgrown with thorn and bramble, and trees ancient beyond reckoning spread their boughs above, warding off the light of sun and moon alike. Even beasts of the forest passed it by, for there was a stillness about the place, not of fear, but of reverence, as though the very earth remembered something sacred that should not be disturbed, and so it might have remained forever a forgotten shrine to a city long fallen, and a man long dead, had not the tide of the world begun once more to turn. For in the north the line of Isildur had not failed, though its flame had burned low, and hidden the air of Yendil walked the wilds as a ranger of the north, known to few by name, and to fewer still by his true heritage, yet in him the blood of westernness ran strong, and the wisdom of many ages had been passed down through quiet generations. He had wandered far from the shores of Linden to the wastes of Ruder, learning the ways of the land and the hearts of men, and in him the fire of old hope was rekindled, though he bore it like a burden, not a crown to him. Came word of things long concealed, of strange lights seen among the hills, of dreams spoken by the wise, and of a name not heard in the north for many years. Lion of the Moon Tower, last lawkeeper of Ithon, in hidden circles the tale was murmured anew, and those who had kept the vigil passed their knowledge one to another until it reached the ears of those who still walked the world in the service of what was lost. Thus it came to pass that Halbarad, chief of the Rangers of the North, and kinsman to the heir of Isildur, gathered a small company and rode south beneath the stars, not in haste nor with heralds, but in silence, as was their custom, for they did not seek glory but knowledge, and the light that had once stood against the shadow in the east. Their journey was long and hidden. They crossed the weather hills in the gray of morning, passed through the marshes of Nindaf by paths none remembered, and came at last to the foothills of the Emin Anin, where the old paths had faded and the lands were wild and strange. Here they moved by signs in memory, guided by tales told in firelight and by the stars above long. Days they spent searching the hollows and combing the wooded ridges, and many times they passed within a bowshot of their goal without knowing it. So well had the hand of time veiled what once had been so fair. At last, on a misty morning when the world seemed hushed and the trees hung heavy with dew, they came upon the dell. The earth dipped gently between two rising slopes, and a narrow stream flowed through its heart clear, and cold vines hung in curtains over a stone arch half swallowed by the roots of a great tree, and beyond lay the ruin. Only a few stones remained standing, covered in moss and lichen, but the air there was still as if time itself had paused. Halbarad halted, and the others with him, and none spoke for a while. Then he dismounted and walked forward alone, for he felt something stir in the air, a memory not his own, and the weight of old power that lingered like the last note of a forgotten song. He entered the ruin and stood before the table of stone, now darkened by age, and leaf fall upon it lay a cloth weathered but whole, and beneath it something that seemed to draw the very light around it like a beacon lost at sea. He lifted the veil, and the relic was revealed once more. Its light shone clear and undamished, neither harsh nor blazing, but gentle and pure, like starlight reflected upon a calm sea. And in that moment Halbarad knew that the tales had not lied, nor had the guardians of the past faltered in their duty. The light of Minas Ithil, though torn from its tower and lost the knowledge of the world, had not been quenched. He bowed his head, and the others followed, each one touched by the semity of that hour. They did not linger. The relic was wrapped once more, this time in a cloth of the north, woven by the kin of Ilas in secret halls far from the sight of the enemy, and borne with reverence from the ruin. The cannon of Lyron was uncovered, and there they gave new offerings, a green leaf of the north, a blade of westernness laid at the foot of the stone, and a ring of silver once worn by a woman who had sung of the white tree in her youth. Then they sealed the tomb again, and spoke the old words of farewell. Back they rode northward through wild country, keeping to the highlands and the forgotten trails. None pursued them, for the enemy's gaze was turned elsewhere, toward the gathering storm that would soon break upon all the lands of the west. But though no foe barred their path, the riders were grim and silent, for they knew the relic they bore was no mere token of elder days, but a light that might yet play some part in the war too. Come when at last they returned to the north, to the wild hills, beyond the Brandywine, they brought the relic into the keeping of the chieftain of the Dunedain, who received it with awe and guarded it in secret, revealing it only to a few among the wise, and in the east the light of minds. Morgal burned ever brighter, a baleful flame upon the mountainside, mocking the memory of all that had once been pure, but the light that layer on bore had not been consumed, and the tale of Minas Ithil was not yet ended, and so the light endured though Minas Ithil lay long, fallen its towers wreathed in sorcery, and its name twisted into a thing of dread. The secret fire that had once gleamed from its heights remained unbroken, hidden in the deep places of the world beyond the reach of the Nine and the long hand of their master. Yet the days grew darker still, and the peace that had once lingered like a breath in the hills of the west waned with the turning years, for the strength of Mordor was rising, and the enemy's purpose slow to kindle now burned with unrelenting flame. The relic brought at last into the north, and laid within the safekeeping of the Dunedain, was not placed in any temple or adorned in halls of gold, for such was not the custom of those who bore the remnants of old Numer in their blood. Instead, it was sealed within a vault beneath the roots of the hills, in a chamber of silence carved in secret beneath an ancient mound once sacred to the elves of Irian. Only a few knew its resting place, and fewer still were permitted to look upon it, for it was held not as a prize nor a weapon, but as a treasure and ember of the elder days, whose light was not to be brandished until the need was greatest among those few who knew of it. Was Aragorn's son of Arathorn heir of Isildur, though in those years he bore other names and traveled the wild lands in silence, keeping the peace where he might, and watching always the borders of shadow. He did not seek the relic out in pride, nor claim it as his inheritance, for he knew well the peril of awakening old powers before their time. But he looked upon it once in the twilight of a winter's eve, and in that moment he beheld not only the memory of the Tower of the Moon, but the weight of his own destiny. It was not spoken of after that day. The chamber was sealed again, and the watch resumed. Yet the relic was not forgotten, though hidden from the sight of foes. Its presence stirred the hearts of the wise, and dreams came more often to the seers of the west, warning of days yet to come, when the towers of men would tremble and the fields of Gondor would burn. Eland of Rivendell, who had known the tower in its youth and watched its fall with sorrow too deep for tears, perceived the shift in the world's breath, and spoke gravely to his kin. The veil grows thin, he said, and the past walks once more in the steps of the living. The shadow stretches from the east like a hand over water, and though we have hidden the flame, still it draws the eye of the enemy. The hour is not yet come, but it hastens, and Lorien to Galadriel turned her gaze eastward, and in the mirror of her thought she saw a light in the darkness, small and steadfast, hidden beneath leaf and stone. And her heart was troubled, for she knew that light would one day be needed, and that sorrow would come with it. But among the folk of the world the relic passed into myth, and the tale of the fall of Minas Ithil became a song sung in the high towers of the south, and the lonely inns of the north remembered as a story of valor and loss of a captain who stood alone and a light that fled into shadow. Few believed it held truth, and fewer still guessed that its end had not yet been written. Minas Morgul meanwhile grew. In power the valley in which it stood was shunned by all living things, and the very earth beneath its foundations turned pale and brittle with corruption. The Morgal Vale became a place of dread, where the air lay thick with ghostly vapors, and no stars pierced the sky from. Its gate issued armies clad in black, and the silence that followed their passage was deeper than any cry. None entered its walls and returned unchanged, for the sorcery of the Nine reached not only the body but the spirit, and even the boldest warriors of Gondor whispered oaths to avoid that place, though they dared not speak their fear aloud. Still the lords of Gondor did not forget the wound upon their land. The skirts of the White Tower, descended from Hurin of Eminan, kept vigil always upon the city of the moon, turned to death, and though they dared not yet strike at its walls, they sent watchmen to the borders of Ethelion and rangers to haunt its eves gathering tidings and striking swift against the foray of the enemy. In those years Famir, son of Denethor, walked often in that land, cloaked in shadow and wisdom, and though he knew nothing of the relic's fate, he had heard the tale of Captain Elian, and he bore it in his heart as one bears a light in a dark what his dreams, it was said, were touched by foresight. And he spoke more than once of a flame that could not be quenched, though it lay hidden far from the fires of war. Thus were the threads drawn ever tighter, and the years gathered like storm clouds on the horizon. The enemy stirred, and Baradur his eye kindled too full flame, and his servants moved abroad in secret and in war, seeking the last lights of resistance to cast them into ruin. The Nazgul grew restless in their tower, their wrath not sated by the years, for they had not forgotten the relic that had slipped through their grasp on the night when Minas Ithil fell in dreams. They saw it still, a pale flame flickering beyond reach of memory that would not die. Then came the word that the One Ring had awakened, and the dark tide began to rise in earnest. But this tale is not of the ring alone, nor of the doom that came upon Middle-earth in the last days of the Third Age. This is the tale of Minas Ithil, and of the light that fled its fall. And though the world had changed beyond the knowing of those who had once dwelt within its silver gates, the story had not yet reached its end, for every shadow that spreads must one day meet the edge of light, and what is lost may yet be found when the hour of need is come. And now the long shadow that had lain upon the east waxed to its fullest breadth, and the hour foreseen by the wise drew near. The land groaned beneath the weight of war, and the hearts of men were tried. In the furnace of great peril fires burned in Oskalith, and the drums of Mordor echoed across the Pelennor, while dark wings wheeled in the skies, and the horns of the Nazg rang out like trumpets of doom. Yet even in such a time, when the strength of Gondor was all but spent, and the white tree bloomed not, there stirred a power long, silent, old, hidden, and patient. In the north where the hills rolled in secret, and the memories of ancient kingdoms slumbered beneath turf and stone, the relic of Minas Ithil lay, yet unspoiled, sealed in its vault of quiet earth. It gave no sound and shed no light, for it waited as it had been charged to do for the moment when its purpose would be made known, but the world was stirring. And the seals of the past, though strong, could not forever hold back the tide of destiny. Aragon, son of Arathorn, having ridden through peril and risen now in the sight of all as the heir of Elendil returned at last to the knowledge that had been entrusted to him in the silent years of his youth, in the dark hours before the battle of the Pelennor fields, when the hosts of Mordor pressed upon the walls of Minster, and the fate of the West hung upon the edge of a blade he sat in council with the sons of Eland, and there spoke again of that which had been. Hidden the light that fled from Minas Ithil, he said, is not wholly lost it was, preserved against this very hour, and if we fall it shall still remain, yet I deem. Now that it was not given only for remembrance, nor to bear witness to what was destroyed there lies in it, strength that does not sleep a fire untouched by shadow, perhaps it was not kindled for this war, nor for the last, but it may yet bear some part in the healing of the world, should hope endure. Beyond the ruin, and though El Rahir spoke no word in reply, his gaze grew distant as one who sees faraway things not yet come to pass, and Eladin, whose thoughts ever followed the flight of the stars, said only, "Let it be guarded still. The hour is not yet." But others moved who knew not such caution in the east. Within the fell towers of Minas Morgul the witch king sat, enthroned his mind, furnace of wrath and foresight. He had seen the rise of the air in the north, and he feared him, though he would not speak it long, had he desired to break the last lineage of Elendil, and the thought that the relic still remained hidden from his grasp stoked his fury like coals stirred by wind he knew not where it was held, but his dreams were troubled, and he beheld again the face of Aurelian, captain of the moon, standing before him with eyes unafraid and sword. Uplifted, the vision tormented him, for it was a memory of a moment when the will of Sauron had not prevailed, and he who had once been a king of men could not wholly forget what he had lost. Therefore he sent forth riders and shadows creeping, things of the mountains and beasts of wing and fong, to search the lands between Anduin and the northern hills. Spies moved among the wild folk, and whispers were carried by the wind. Some among the Dumadine vanished, and were not found, and fear began to grow even among the steadfast, but the relic remained hidden. His guardians had changed for Halbar, and many of the rangers were now far afield summoned to the south to stand beside their lord in the war of the ring. Others had taken their place, young men and women of the north, untested in battle, but strong of heart, to whom the tale of Aaron had been passed like a flame from one candle to another. They kept no record, wrote no names, and bore no heraldry, but in the hidden places they watched and waited, and among them the story of Minas Ithil was kept alive, not merely as a tragedy of fallen towers, but as a song of quiet defiance of a light that fled and yet did not fade. Then came the day when the skies turned red with smoke and the earth trembled, and the cry of the black land was heard from the slopes of the Effluith to the shores of the sea. The ring had been cast into the fire, and Barad-dûr was thrown down in ruin. The power of Sauron perished, and his hosts were scattered like leaves before a storm, and in that moment far away in the hills of the north the relic stirred its light, returned unbidden, spilling forth like the dawn after long night the stone chamber wherein it lay was filled with radiance unseen since the fall of the tower, and those who guarded it fell too, their knees weeping, for they felt in their hearts that the burden they had borne was not in vain. Messengers were sent with haste to the new king of Gondor, now seated upon the throne of his fathers and minister. And though the city still mourned its dead, and the white tree had not yet blossomed, hope ran swift as the waters of Anduin in the spring. When word came to Aragorn of what had passed, he bowed his head and was silent, and the steward beside him beheld tears in the eyes of the king. Let it be brought to the south, said he at last, not to be praised nor paraded, but to be returned to its rightful place, for the time has come at last to close the tale of Minas Ithil, not in sorrow, but in honor. So it was that a company of the Dunedain rode once more across the land, bearing with them the relic that had fled the fire and waited long in stillness. They passed through Honoran and over the river at Osgiliath, and as they entered the ruined vale of Morg, now abandoned and silent, the light of the relic grew brighter, and the shadows fled from its path, and before the broken gate where once the nine had stood they halted, and the captain of the guard drew forth the cloth and lifted the relic into the air. Its light filled the vale. Minas Morgul shuddered, and a great crack was heard from deep within the mountain. The white fire passed over the stones, and the walls began to crumble, not by siege nor by hand of man, but as if the very memory of the tower rejected what it had become. Thus the shadow that had claimed Minzil was broken, and though the city would never be raised again in the likeness of its former glory, its fall was avenged not by vengeance, but by the return of that which had been lost, and the relic, having fulfilled its purpose, was borne away once more, not to be hidden again, but to shine in the halls of the new king as a beacon of the west, rekindled. Now the tale draws to its end, and though the shadows have passed and the great fires have been quenched, there remains yet a silence as after a great storm, when the earth lies hushed and the winds hold their breath, unsure whether the peace is true or only a pause before the next trial. But in that silence new songs were born, and the memory of the Tower of the Moon was no longer sung as a lament only, but as a tale of endurance, of light, unyielding, even when all seemed lost. The relic, that vessel of ancient grace, born through ruin and war, hidden in the wild and guarded through long years by the faith of few, was brought at last to the white city, there beneath the banners of the king, and beside the sapling of the white tree. It was placed not upon a throne, nor in a vault, but in the hall of memory, where the names of the fallen are carved in stone, and where none speak loudly, for the voice of history echoes softly. There it rested, upon a stand of silver wrought by the hands of the elves of Lothlorien, and around it stood no guards, for none would raise a hand against it, nor bear the thought of desecration. Its light, gentle and pure, bathed the hall in a radiance not of this world, neither gold as the sun nor silver as the moon, but like the mingling of both in the time before the sun first rose, when the two trees still flowered in the land beyond the sea. Many came to look upon it, lords of Gondor and captains of the West elves from the havens, who knew its kingship to the light of Valinor, and dwarves who spoke of the ancient jewels that glimmered in the deeps of the world before the awakening of the first stars. But none touched it, and none dared ask its true name, for though the king called it Ithil the moon's flame, there were whispers among the law masters that its soul was older than the hills, and that it had passed through many hands and many dooms to reach its rest. The king himself came often in quiet hours when the hall was empty and the torches burned low. He would stand before it and speak no word, but the burden of his long road, the trials of the crown, and the wounds of war seemed to lighten in its presence, and sometimes it is said he would remember Erelon, though he had never known him in the flesh, remember him not as a ghost of the past, but as a brother in purpose, a kindred heart who had stood in his own day at the edge of darkness, and had not faltered in the years that followed. The realm of Gondor was renewed. The white tree blossomed, and the lands that had lain desolate were healed. Ithilien, once a place of shadows, bloomed again beneath the care of Famir and his people, and though no stone of Minas Morgul was left standing, no tower raised. In its place the valley itself was cleansed by time, and wild flowers grew. Upon the slopes where once only poison had crept of the relic's deeper nature, little was ever said, though it was known to those of wisdom that its light did not diminish nor change, but remained constant through the seasons, like a star fixed beyond the turning heavens. Some believed it was bound to the fate of the West, and that as long as it endured so, too would the hope of men. Others claimed it bore within it the blessing of the valor, a last gift sent with the faithful, who had fled the ruin of Númenor, and that its light was a shard of the greater glory that lay beyond the sea and still. There were others quiet in speech and reluctant to proclaim their thoughts, who said that the relic was not only a light, but a memory that it remembered and Aaron and all those who had perished in the long night, not with sorrow, but with honor. It bore not only the fire of the past, but the witness of sacrifice, and in its glow was a song that only the heart could hear, a song of towers long fallen, and of hope preserved not through might, but through faith. So passed the days and the years, and the relic came to be a symbol not of mourning, but of resolve. When young captains took up their arms, they would go first to the hall of memory, and look upon the light, and remember the tale of the fall of Minas Ithil, the night when light turned to shadow, and a man stood alone upon the gate and would not yield, though all hope seemed lost. And in the high halls of learning, where the scrolls of the old world were kept, the tale of Aurelian was written in the tongue of the West, not as a mere chronicle, but as a song long and flowing, its verses carried from tower to hearth, from father to child, as a part of the great song of Middle Earth. Even the elves, who seldom recorded the deeds of men, save in times of great wonder or sorrow, preserved his name in their books. And in the hidden places of Lorien and Rivendell his story was spoken with reverence, for though he was mortal, his spirit had shone with a light akin to their own. And in the fall of Minas Ithil they saw again the courage that had once defied Morgoth in the deeps of time. And when at last the fourth age dawned, and the world grew older, and the last of the great elves passed into the west, the relic remained still, shining with the same quiet light, untouched by the fading of magic or the wear of years. It stood as a flame in stillness, a memory made flesh, a light drawn from a time before the breaking of the world. And though Minas Ithil rose no more, and the white towers no longer crowned the mountains, The spirit of the moon tower lived on in the hearts of those who would not bow in. The hands of those who bore the burdens of the age, and in the tale of night, when a single man stood between shadow and light and would not be moved, so ends the tale of the fall of minis. Ethel the night, when light turned to shadow.